Hi, my name is Lisa Mangilia. Welcome to the History of Diving Museum. Welcome to those of you that are joining by Zoom. We're here tonight with Matthew Lawrence, from NOAA, who is going to be our presenter. But I would like to thank our members for being here. If you're not a member, I invite you to be a member. Even if you only come to the Keys once a year, it's still, you're supporting educational outreach, you're supporting the exhibits and the museum and everything that we do in our mission. So we invite you to do that. We want to thank our longtime members and actually our board members of the Vitale family, who's our sponsor tonight. We appreciate that very much. Our upcoming events, currently we are participating in the Blue Star Museum program. That's that active duty military are free every day at the History of Diving Museum during the Blue Star program, which is May Armed Services Day to Labor Day. Up to 5 family members can come. So as our military is traveling, or if they're getting transferred to different bases, it gives them an idea and a way to learn about their community. So we have that going on. And we also have this Saturday guided tours. So if you want to come back for a guided tour, Julia will be hosting those. And we also have a Mark V dive experience. So for some of you we have people that have been in the Navy and they're like, I didn't get to do that. Well, now you have an opportunity. We have a raffle. You can go online, divingmuseum.org, and find out more about that. The Immerse Yourself series is a free presentation that we do on the 3rd Wednesday of every month. We have Dr. Mickey McComb, who's going to be coming down. She's a shark researcher, and she actually is doing some work in the Florida Keys right now. And she'll be telling us, she's in the Women Diving Hall of Fame, and she's going to be telling us some of the projects and things that she's going to be working on. But tonight, I'm really excited to have Matthew here. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary and NOAA have been very good to the museum. We've helped us out on several different projects, extending our educational outreach and that South Florida connection to diving. And when we were putting together Salvaging the Deep, we did it was brought to our attention that Crane Point Hammock in Marathon actually has some pieces from the HMS Loo, which was eventually used to name Looe Key. And I'm not going to give your presentation away, but Matthew and Brenda Allmeyer were very helpful in putting that story together so that we could include it into the exhibit. So we greatly appreciate that. I look forward to learning more, and thank you all for being here tonight. For those of you that are on Zoom, let us know where you're visiting or where you're logging in from, how many people are with you. If you have a question, put it in the chat. We're going to be doing question and answers at the end, and Julia will be bringing those into the room so we can address those.
Wonderful.
All right, thank you.
Good evening, folks. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all. And as Lisa mentioned, this genesis for this presentation is the work that we did establishing this connection between the early archaeological investigation at the HMS Loo site and this concept of salvaging the deep and the difference in the way that we look at archaeological sites. And so that's largely what I'm going to be speaking about this evening. And I hope that it raises interest in learning more about the Florida Keys maritime heritage. So I'm coming to you this evening from the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. It encompasses 3,800 square miles of ocean stretching all the way from Miami out to and surrounding the dry Tortugas. This very special place protects the natural environment and underwater cultural heritage. And basically, the idea is that people can go out and enjoy the area, recreate, make a living in the sanctuary, but that we want to protect it so that future generations are able to do the same. So I work in our administrative office in Key Largo, if anyone is looking for me in the future. But our main office is in Key West, where we have a 6,000 square foot interpretive center, the Nancy Foster Center, that is free and open to the public, and free parking, which is always a rarity. So I would encourage you all that when you head down to Key West again, head out towards Fort Zachary Taylor State Park, and you'll see the Eco Discovery Center there on the right. It's a great place to stop in. The air conditioning is really cool after you've been sweating all day walking the streets of Key West. And It's really a fantastic place. And we've just recently redone the exhibits there. And so there's lots more information to learn about the National Marine Sanctuary. I also want to direct you to the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary's new website. We've just recently updated it, greatly expanded the information that's available, and dramatically increased the information about our underwater cultural heritage and the shipwrecks that are in the National Marine Sanctuary. So since all of you appear to be probably interested in that kind of thing, I would really encourage you to check out our website. It's much, much better than it was before, and there's a lot more information to learn about our maritime heritage. So the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is part of a system of national marine sanctuaries, 16 of them in 2 marine national monuments. The very most recent one is now in Lake Ontario, at Lake Ontario National Marine Sanctuary, designated to protect a collection of historic shipwrecks in that area, but it extends all the way across the Pacific to our territories in the far reaches, as far as out as American Samoa. The very first National Marine Sanctuary was designated to protect the ironclad warship USS Monitor off the North Carolina coast. And I think you can read some more about it and learn about that in the exhibit there at Salvaging the Deep. But this system here is really to protect America's ocean parks for the American public so that you can go out and enjoy these spectacular places. And we're managed through the Department of Commerce's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So the folks who provide you your weather forecasts and your fisheries management also do the National Marine Sanctuary System. So I'm going to take you a few years back into the past here. We're going to get to the early 18th century. At this point in time, Great Britain and Spain were really at odds on the high seas, and it was resulting from territorial and trade disputes here in the Americas. Both countries were turning to privateering to try to harass and raid each other's merchant vessels. So it was a really conflicted time here on the waters around the Florida Keys. Not far away, on April 9th, 1731, a Spanish privateer, the San Antonio, which was sailing out of Havana and captained by Juan Leon Fandino, captured a British trade vessel named the Rebecca, and its captain was Robert Jenkins. So the Rebecca was carrying a really valuable cargo of sugar, tortoise shell, and silver, and was headed towards London. And the Spanish officers from the privateer did not treat the crew well on the Rebecca. And in fact, they really abused Captain Jenkins. You can see on this illustration, they are hauling into the rigging and then dropping him down. It's really a poor treatment of a captain. And ultimately, the worst insult was that one of the Spanish officers cut off of Jenkins' ear in the process of this harassment and told Jenkins that he should take that back and show it to King George II. So a really dramatic event for Jenkins, but really, it was not that sort of big of a deal at the time. You know, basically, we think of it as a brutal situation now, but hey, this is what happened out there on the high seas. But so at this time in 1731, really, this incident really didn't inflame anyone's passions. It didn't really stir up the feelings about conflict between Spain and Great Britain. But by 1738, that had changed. Public perceptions about this incident were that, man, this was really horrible mistreatment of Captain Jenkins. He was called before British Parliament to testify about his mistreatment. And using Jenkins' ear injury, they were able to essentially stir up so much pro-war feelings that Britain declared war on Spain on October 19th, 1739. And so nowadays, we refer to this conflict as the War of Jenkins' Ear. At the time, that's not how it was thought of. And really, that name was added to the conflict in 1858 by a historian who was writing about it. So we now think the War of Jenkins' Ear, but for the European powers, that was really kind of just another day in the conflict in Europe. So while you have most of the major naval actions in the War of Jenkins' Ear happening by the end of 1742, the whole conflict ends up morphing into the European War of Austrian Succession. And so this conflict drug on until 1748, when the combatant parties end up signing a treaty. Basically, everyone just kind of retreats to their corners. All the seized property is returned. And there's really no winner as a result of all of this conflict that was going on. So, importantly, the British Navy was a critical aspect of this conflict. And really, European navies in general were developing highly specialized warships beginning in the 17th century that were transitioning away from what we think of sort of the grapple and board and the chaotic hand-to-hand combat that sort of characterized naval warfare prior to that. And so what you start to see is this new focus on concentrated cannon fire. We now had warships that were capable of firing their cannons to such an extent that they could take down combatants. And so in this process, the British began classifying their warships on a rating system, so they would know what kind of vessels that were sort of in a particular battle. And at the time, the first rate ships were the largest and the most powerful warships. And that could be anywhere from 70 to 100 cannon mounted on these vessels. These vessels were designed to fight broadside to each other in what's called the line of battle formation or line ahead. Basically, you think of the classic naval engagement where the ships are kind of passing each other, shooting at each other. That's really what we're talking about here. However, when you get down to the smaller vessels, like the HMS Loo, generally called frigates, they were classified as fifth-rate vessels. They were really not armed well enough to be going head-to-head and slugging it out in those line of battle situations. And they would not have basically been able to fight against those really heavily armed vessels. And so what you have is this class of vessels that served as patrol vessels out there on the high seas, essentially extending the control of the British Navy out to the farthest reaches. And so these frigates were really out there to fight enemy privateers and pirates, and anything that was too big for them to take on, they could sail away. They were very fast sailors and much more maneuverable than these large line of battle ships. So what we have is this very distinct classes of vessels engaged in the naval activities. So HMS Loo arrives on the scene in 1741. It was built in the Thomas Snelgrove shipyard in the Limehouse district of London and launched into the Thames River on December 29th of that year. It measured 124 feet long and 35 feet wide, and it carried 44 cannons. Half of those cannons fired 12-pound cannonballs, and the other half fired 6-pound balls. So basically, the cannons were lined along the lines on the sides of the ship. And so you had 22 cannons firing on one side and 22 firing on the other. So you can see the plan here. This is the vessel's profile view of how it would have looked. Really the only contemporary illustration that we have of what the HMS Loo looked like. So after it completed its fitting out and got all of its cannon mounted, at the time, Captain George Carnegie took the warship into the Bay of Biscay to start these patrols against the Spanish privateers. And by July of 1742, the Loo was fighting Spanish privateers homeported there at Vigo on the northwest coast of Spain. So it was actively engaged in that European conflict. The following year in 1743, Captain Ashby Utting took command, and he was assigned to head across the Atlantic to patrol the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic areas and to harass merchant shipping, Spanish merchant shipping, and to combat the privateers that were circulating in this area, like the vessel that attacked Robert Jenkins. So Captain Utting's orders read, having ordered His Majesty's ship under your command to be refitted at Portsmouth for a voyage to North America, cleaned, sheathed, and graved, and her provisions completed to 6 months of all species, except beer, and that as much as she can conveniently stow, and stowed accordingly. You are hereby required and directed to repair with her into Portsmouth Harbor and strictly to observe the following instructions. You are to give constant attendance. So this is what he's being told to do, to head out on the high seas and proceed to the Americas. And in particular, HMS Loo was to respond to the concerns of the colonial governor of South Carolina. He was worried that Spanish privateers were going to attack his ports and invade and take over, and that colonial shipping in the area was also going to be attacked by the same Spanish privateers that were circling in the area. And so Loo was to get in the way, prevent that kind of activity, and reinforce the British colonial powers. Under the command of Captain Utting, on the morning of Saturday, February 4th, 1744, the HMS Loo was sailing in the Straits of Havana, just north of Havana Harbor, when the ship's lookout sighted an unknown sail on the horizon. After a short chase, Loo caught up to the unknown vessel. The sailors on board the Loo recognized that vessel, even though it was flying a Spanish flag, as the English merchant ship Philander Betty, for you, which had been recently captured by Spanish authorities off of South Carolina. Believing Philander Betty's crew to be employed as agents of Spain, Captain Utting seized the ship and he set sail for Charleston, South Carolina, to return it to its owners. So en route to safe harbor with their prize, the night's watch on the Loo was ordered to drop a lead line every half hour to ensure the depth of the vessel. Before, we had these electronic depth sounders and things that made it really easy for us to navigate. You had to throw the lead on a line down and have the seaman pull it up and try to make sure that you were staying in deep enough water. And so as they were cruising along, and so they cast the lead at around 1 a.m. and found that the water depth was over 300 feet deep. Assumed everything was fine. 15 minutes later, however, as the sailors were preparing to cast the lead again, they found that Loo was fast approaching breaking waves. Oh my God. So seeing the white water, the officer of the watch sounded the alarm, but it was really too late. The ship's momentum carried it such that it struck near its stern. Captain Utting, who was below, rushed on deck and immediately ordered the vessel's mainsail to be backed, trying to press the vessel off the reef and prevent it from further going ashore. But within moments, the crew found that the vessel's rudder was broken off and the ship was taking on water. Sailors began to man the pumps, but a series of waves just pushed the vessel further onto the reef and it began to sink. So unfortunately, Philander Betty, following nearby on the Loo, also slammed into the reef and battered the waves at the same time, making it unseaworthy. So here we go. As day breaks, Captain Utting is having to order his men to evacuate, gather all the provisions they can, and to head to a small sandy cay inshore of the reef. And so 280 men took refuge on this small island. And so really at the time, they didn't really know where they were, but Captain Utting and his officers realized that although they thought they might have grounded in the Bahamas, they in fact had grounded on the offshore reefs off Looe Key. So they really had no concept of how quickly the Gulf Stream was pushing them and what was going on. So as the shipwreck survivors assembled on the island, they sighted a small sloop sailing offshore. And basically Captain Utting said, hey, we need to attract the attention of this vessel, otherwise we could be stuck here for a lot longer. So they fired signals to try to attract the sloop's attention, but it just kept on sailing on. It totally ignored it. So thinking quickly, Captain Utting dispatched his officers in 2 of the small boats that they carried and sent them out to chase down this sloop, recognizing it was probably going to be the only thing they could use to evacuate people off of the sand cay. So they headed out with crews and managed to capture this vessel within about a day's time period. And they brought this vessel, which turned out to be a Spanish sloop, back to the island. And I'm not quite sure how this works, but the original occupants of that sloop somehow abandoned their vessel. And I don't know where they went. Maybe they got off on another small boat, and so the British Marines managed to get the larger boat, but that has not really made it through the history books. So I'm wondering what happened to those poor people when they saw a whole bunch of heavily armed Marines pursuing them and wanting to take their ship. So once they had this Spanish sloop in hand, they began to modify their small boats for a longer passage. They secured all the supplies they could salvage from the Loo and the Philander Betty. And so after completing their preparations over several days, 60 sailors embarked in a modified longboat. 10 sailors boarded a small yawl. These are the HMS Loo's boats. 20 manned the captain's barge, another of the Loo's boats, and 184 climbed into this captured sloop, which was described as only being 30 tons in size. So it's a pretty small boat. So very, very crowded conditions. And so the overloaded fleet set sail, hoping to make a New Providence in the Bahamas, but wind conditions did not favor this sort of easterly course from the lower Florida Keys, and all the vessels got kind of separated, and ultimately the sloop with Captain Utting in command could not make towards that port. And so he determined his next best option was to sail for South Carolina. So ultimately, 6 days later, they're able to reach Port Royal on February 13. The other boats were able to make it to New Providence. They were rescued earlier, but I can only imagine after 6 days with that many people on the sloop, it was probably a very close one situation. But Captain Utting, neither Captain Utting nor his officers were court-martialed and found to be liable for this incident. And basically, they found them to be not at fault for the sinking of the Loo. And in fact, when Captain Utting received his next command, which was the HMS Gosport, many of the officers and sailors from the Loo requested to be with him on the next ship. So I think that speaks a lot towards his leadership in this sort of situation. So let's fast forward a couple hundred years here, 200 years to be almost exact here. So the HMS Loo remained forgotten for almost 200 years until 1950, when a group, a very adventurous family, the Cryle, down to the Keys looking for adventure and to find treasure. George Cryle was a well-known cancer doctor at the Cleveland Clinic. And this was not the family's first expedition in this sort of situation. They had traveled to the Great Lakes in California, spearfishing and diving, and generally being all in the water. And so I think they got the idea, man, if we head to the Florida Keys, we can go treasure hunting and have this amazing adventure. And so when they get down to Marathon, they connect with a waterman named Bill Thompson. He's been out navigating around the Florida Keys for years, and he has seen a number of wrecks on the seafloor as he's looking overboard where he sees cannon. So he takes the family out to these locations and shows them these shipwrecks. And they are just enthralled by the situation. And the first shipwreck they visit is now known as the Ivory Wreck. It's sunk at Delta Shoal and is believed to have been a 17th century vessel carrying enslaved Africans. So that's a really important shipwreck here in the Florida Keys. The second shipwreck that he takes them to had a very large number of cannon on it, and it was located at Looe Key. And so they were just over the moon of being able to go down and visit these shipwrecks, and they went to town, basically. So the Cryles and their friends who were with them just began digging into the shipwreck with abandon. They were just pulling things up from the bottom. You could certainly call it treasure fever. They were just so excited by their new discovery in the situation. And not surprisingly, not long after, Key's most famous treasure hunter of the time shows up. Art McGee comes into the picture, and he's heard about this family and heard about this situation, and he wants to kind of get involved in the fun. So he brings all of his knowledge into the mix, and he's able to use his, I think it's called a diving hood. There we go, surface supply rig, and help with the digging that's going on the shipwreck sites. So I think one of the most fantastic people in this situation is Mrs. Jane Cryle, and she proves to be an amazing underwater cinematographer back at a time when who was actually taking a camera underwater. I'm not sure exactly what the earliest dates for that, but 1950 has got to be pretty early in all of this. And so she sets out to capture underwater video of all the family's adventures using this homemade underwater video camera, which is basically some sort of lens thing screwed into a rubber bag that has a closure strap on it. And it's just the craziest thing. But she is just right in there doing this. You can see her, she's borrowed someone's Jackie Brown mask, and you can see all the air hoses, and she's got the camera in her hand, looking a little bit like she's not having the most fun, probably. pinned to the reef at that point, and she's getting, a briefing on how to use that surface supply mask. So I think she's really an interesting person in all of this, who really went to great extents. And the really fantastic thing is we actually have her home video from the very first visits of the trial family to the Loo here. And so we're gonna—
We're at Bill Thompson's in Marathon in the Florida Keys, rechecking our charts for the location of wrecks on the treacherous reefs. We start our search 5 miles from shore, on the edge of the Gulf Stream, within a stone's throw of great freighters, in the same lanes followed centuries ago by treasure galleons. We're ready to go overboard with all the children. We're swimming across the reef, searching the bottom for cannon. Susie nestles on her life preserver, looking small in the vast expanse of ocean. All at once, we see something unusual about the bottom. Strange formations in the coral below. The bottom of a cavern 30 feet deep lurks a monstrous fish, a 300-pound sea bass, bigger than we are. But there's another reef to explore, the lonely reef of Looe Key, where Bill Thompson had once seen a cannon. We have a new captain, Captain Flint, and he has a special look in his eye as we put him aboard something smaller than our barge, a little Chris-craft, and set sail for the open sea. Although it seemed to be a beautiful day, Dave, who was quite an ancient mariner, looked up at the sky and seemed worried about the weather. We anchored by a broken buoy on the inner side of the reef in blue, mysterious water. And then we jump overboard. And we swim seaward across the reef. We swim through the twilight jungle of the reef to the edge of a canyon. There, 30 feet below, we find another wreck. There are some of its huge cannon, like spectral sentinels standing guard. There are piles of cannon. See them? Cannons crisscrossed in the coral, cannons with sea fans growing on their muzzles. And there are barracudas, too. Even under the ledges the cannon lie, cemented to the coral by the salty precipitate of time. Barracudas everywhere guard the wreck and float over the cannon, half buried in the sand, with only a little of their barrels protruding. And there's a 12-foot anchor. And near it is a hawser ring of another huge anchor with a 10-foot bank of coral growing over its flukes and shank. But most exciting of all, interspersed with the cannon and the anchor, are piles of metal ingots crusted with coral and so heavy that we cannot lift them. Some were square, like the ones these parrotfish float over. Others are oblong, 2.5 feet long and 8 inches thick. They are guarded by a special guard. But look, even the barracudas are running away. For here comes the warrior of the sea, an 8-foot, sharp-nosed shark, one of the vicious sharks of the open ocean. He stalks his prey like a white shadow on the sea. The lure of discovery is greater than the fear of sharks. Dave dropped down on the bottom in his Jackie Brown with his little bucket to reconnoiter the wreck, to see what he could find in the sand, to figure out where we should start to dig. The barracuda's figuring too. In the meantime, we start chipping the coral from one of the cannon to see if it is iron or brass. If it's brass, it's worth $1,000. Coral is so hard that it can't be dented. But Dave has found something exciting. Throwing off his mask, he streaks to the surface. What's he got? A pocket full of coins and silver buttons. They look like gold, and according to an age-old test, they bite like gold. They scrape like gold. One of the coins bears a triple crown of Sweden, the date 1720. Well, if there's gold on the bottom, what are those bars made of? As I go down to look at the pile of bars on my, look at that pile of bars on my right. That pile of metal behind the amberjack is silver. It's worth $1 million. So we'll try to raise one of them. Bill ties up an oblong bar and starts to the top. But look out, Bill. Someone's after you with a dagger, and it's Jim cutting the air hose. His conscience wins out, however. Bill gets up safely. And what's he bringing with him? It's a long bar of metal with a cannonball attached. It's time now to go to work and raise that metal ingot. I pull a reluctant Davy Dyke aboard. He wanted to go right on finding coins in the sand. Now here's a picture of 4 men pulling on what they think is a fortune in silver, and they're really pulling. We can lift it just off the bottom, but it's too heavy to bring up. And now, a picture of real dejection. No one likes to leave millions of dollars worth of silver on the bottom of the ocean. We'll go overboard and try at least to get a sample of it for analysis. Behind the barracuda, Jim is sawing away on an ingot. I pry at another, but all I pry is myself. All Jim could get was a little piece of what he hoped was metal. It proved to be nothing but uncut flint, with which all the metal was covered. No one could think of a way to raise the metal without better equipment. The flint was used to be used for the flintlock muskets. But evening was falling. We were 20 miles from harbor. We made a treasure map and planned to return the next day with equipment to raise the bars. If you can remember those angles, you can sail straight to the wreck. We left an underwater buoy to help us find the wreck, but put it so that no one else could see it. On the way home, Dave chipped the coral from a fine old pewter tankard that he had found with the coins in the bottom of the sand. It was an old English baluster mug made around 1700. Every chunk of coral was like a Christmas present. Inside one of them, we found an axe head, badly decomposed. Cannonballs were big ones, most of them 6-pounders, and there were fragments of glass, which were the bottoms of rum bottles. Was this our pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? The metal bars may not be of solid Panamanian silver, but somewhere, sometime, on some other treasure diving holiday, we still may find the treasures that we seek. And that is the end of our adventure tonight.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about the eardrums. So that was 1950, and in 1951, the Kryles returned to the Florida Keys, and with them they brought Mendel Peterson, who was an American pioneer in underwater archaeology. He was the curator at the time for naval history at the Smithsonian Institution. So they were really interested in trying to figure out what this shipwreck was that they had found. So really, we can look back and easily say, well, of course it's the Loo, but at the time, no one had really any idea why Looe Key was named Looe Key. So everyone sort of suspected this shipwreck was 200 years old, but no one really knew how to go about this except for Mr. Peterson, really because the field of underwater archaeology at the time was really in its infancy. And people were more looking at it as antiquarian investigations, where you would pull up a bunch of artifacts and kind of, see what that can tell you without really looking at the archaeological side. So we have Mendel Peterson, the Kryles, Art McKee, and another family, Ed and Marion Link, who then began to use powerful water jets and airlifts to suck the sediment away from the artifacts so that they could be more easily recovered. And at the same time, those iron ingots and the cannons found on the site began to talk to Mendel Peterson, and he began to recognize this as a warship from the early 1700s. So as the excavation progressed, there were numerous artifacts found by the crew that had the British broad arrow stamp on them. Basically, this is a symbol that was affixed to crown or government property in Great Britain to help identify it and to keep it from being pilfered. So they began to narrow in on the identity of this ring.
Is it not advancing? Oh, there.
There we go. Just did not like that response. We're good. Thank you. So one of the really amazing things about this expedition here is that the Kryles and the other folks who were on this expedition donated all of those artifacts that they were pulling up out of the bottom to the Smithsonian in the early 1950s after they were recovered. And so the Smithsonian sort of maintained this collection and used these artifacts in displays at the Smithsonian Institution for decades until around 2012, when they sought to find a new home for these artifacts, a repository that was closer to the wreck site so that people doing research on the Loo could more easily access those artifacts. And at that time, the Crane Point Museum agreed to become the trustee for these artifacts. And so we are really privileged to have been allowed by museum director Charlotte Quinn of the Crane Point Museum to loan those artifacts to the History of Diving Museum. If you have a chance to go into the Salvaging the Deep exhibit, you can see many of these artifacts, and you might even recognize some of them from the video, like the X or the fog bases right there. You can see them in person right next door. And so these artifacts really allow us as an archaeologist to start looking at the ship more holistically. We can look at what was like to be on board the HMS Loo. We can look at and see how these artifacts tell us about how the ship was constructed and fought. And they really are an untapped source for future archaeological investigations. So we're pretty amazing that 70 years later here, these artifacts are still around and available for us. Unfortunately, HMS Loo's cannons have not fared so well. And so in 1951, with Mendel Peterson there, they raised one of the cannons using Ed Link's yacht, the Blue Heron. It's pretty crazy to see them swinging this several thousand-pound cannon up on like a pleasure yacht. I'm surprised they didn't sink it. But Ed Link was an amazing engineer. He developed the Link trainer, which was used by many pilots in World War II to learn how to fly aircraft. And so he knew his engineering, and they got the cannon ashore. They removed that incrustation from it, basically beat it off with sledgehammers, and that revealed the Tudor Rose crest on these cannons. So we have all these parts coming together to tell us this is a British warship from the first part of the 18th century. So all of these artifacts, basically, when Mendel Peterson went back to the archives, he looked through registers of British warships that had been lost in this area, and he said, aha, the HMS Loo. And that totally makes sense because this place is known as Looe Key. So it seems obvious to us, but at the time, this was a pretty revolutionary process. Unfortunately, today, there are no cannons left on the shipwreck. So you can't go there and see these things. They were most likely taken there to be sold for scrap metal. or if there are any that are still around the Florida Keys anywhere. I have not ever encountered one. If anyone ever hears of someone saying, hey, we have a Loo cannon, please let me know. That would be pretty amazing. But unfortunately, most of them probably ended up in the scrapyard. However, 9 cannons are still in existence at the replica of Fort William Henry on Lake George in New York. These were determined by an archaeologist up there by the name of Joseph Zarzinski. He tracked the cannons down and looked at the archives for the replica and found that in 1954, Art McKee had sold cannons to this replica fort that was just being built and opened up as a tourist attraction on Lake George. And so you can go and see these cannons. Unfortunately, they've been outside all of that time. They were not properly treated. So all of those details, like unfortunately the Tudor rose that helped identify them, it's no longer visible on these cannons. But it's still neat to see that these things still exist somewhere. And so I would highly recommend that if you're interested in the story further, there's a great documentary on YouTube called The Iron Centuries, where they go into this whole process of basically determining that these cannons came from the HMS Loo. So it's a really, really interesting story. So this amazing story of the HMS Loo and the amazing natural beauty of Looe Key Reef led to the area being designated the Looe Key National Marine Sanctuary in 1981. And then in 1990, when the larger Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary was designated, it was incorporated into the management. Looe Key is now protected as a sanctuary preservation area, which is a no-touch, no-take area. There are dozens of mooring balls out there for you to tie your boat up to and not damage the corals, and to enjoy this really beautiful shallow spur and groove coral formations out there. Unfortunately, there is no sand key left there for you to go on and experience what the sailors from the Loo were experiencing. That has since eroded away and no longer now breaks the waves. It may return. We see things like that happen in Conch Reef when all of a sudden a sandy island appears out of nowhere. So, depending on the right conditions, maybe Looe Key will return. But what was surprising to me when I started digging into this story was that really little archaeological research had been done following sanctuary designation to learn more about the HMS Loo. And so I set out to, bring the story back to light, folks. So in 2023, in partnership with East Carolina University's program in maritime studies, we revisited the HMS Loo shipwreck. So our goal was to monitor the site and to apply new photogrammetric imaging techniques to record the shipwreck. So we wanted to know, what does the shipwreck look like now, so that we can tell in the future if there are changes to the shipwreck, what is going on. And so the use of photogrammetry, which involves taking multiple photos at different angles and then bringing those photos into a computer software program to create a 3D model, is a really great way to do this, because we can get these very detailed models that allow us to do the site monitoring that we need to. And so these 3D models can be as much as millimeter accuracy. And when you look at from one model to the next, you can actually quantify changes of like movement of sediment and the appearance of artifacts and things like that, that can help us determine about what sort of environmental or human factors are influencing the site, so that we can potentially update our management so that this place and this shipwreck will be there for future generations to enjoy. So this is the 3D model assembled from 1,100 photographs. We have 2 GoPros mounted on a diver scooter, a DPV, that we take down there and go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, running transects along the wreck site. And in this, you can begin to pick out some of the details, like square blocks and oblong rectangular shapes, which is what remains of those iron ballast ingots that are scattered around the site. So unfortunately, like the cannon, we saw the pictures from Jane's video of how many of these ballast ingots were there initially. There are just not nearly as many left, probably also picked up by the same folks who were salvaging the cannon or people who were infected by that same sort of treasure fever that got to the crimes. But what's great about this can really show the topography of the spur and groove formation in much more detail than we could if we were actually trying to hand draw an archaeologicals. So in addition to this, the photogrammetric documentation, we also recorded all the visible ballast ingots, and we're looking to do further research about the use of iron ingot ballast to weigh down ships. Basically, it was much more effective to use an iron ingot as opposed to a rock, which is what we think of as ballast in most cases. But it was only something that was available really to the navies of the time. It's far too expensive for a merchant vessel to pay for that iron ballast to be installed in the ship. But it was much more effective at keeping the ship upright in heavy wind. And along the lines of continuing research, what is particularly interesting is that HMS Loo is associated with two other British warships, all occurring within like a 6-year period from 1742 to 1748 here. They were losing ships right and left in this area. So we're coordinating with the National Park Service, who managed the HMS Tiger and Dry Tortugas National Park, and the HMS Bowie in Biscayne National Park, to look at basically all of these shipwrecks together, hopefully use the differences between them to identify differences in the environment, looking at the archaeological assemblage to see what that can tell us about these different shipwreck sites. The HMS Tiger, for example, was built in actually the 1600s, so it was around for a much longer time than, say, the Loo, which really was only around for a very, very short time. So each lies in a somewhat different environment. The HMS Bowie is in a sort of a sandy and seagrass area, so much of its wooden hull is actually preserved underneath the sediment level. So that's really an interesting site that can tell us a lot more about how these ships were put together. And so looking at these three together is a really interesting way for us to tell this larger story about how the British Navy was patrolling Florida Keys, looking out for their interests in the area. And so I would really like to acknowledge the folks at East Carolina University's Maritime Studies program, the professors Jennifer McKinnon and Nathan Richards, who led the 2023 field school with me. And I also want to recognize those students who participated in the 2024 museum studies class that helped design the exhibit that you see here at the museum and provided a bunch of the information that I have in the presentation tonight. Of course, without the support of the Crane Point Hammock Museum and Nature Center and CEO Charlotte Quinn, her assistant Jessica Smith, we would not have been able to get the access to these artifacts and be able to bring them to you. The first time that they've really been on exhibit here in the Florida Keys. So I think that's pretty exciting. And of course, I really need to recognize Trial family member John Steichen, who provided me with underwater video and information about his family. It's really a fantastic story that he's been able to kind of keep alive through his family history. And so thank him for making that accessible. And I hope you all enjoyed the presentation this evening. I'd love to take any questions you might have. Yes.
Did they ever find the merchant ship that was being towed by the Loo, the Betty? I think it's the Betty.
Yes. So the question is, did they ever find the Belander Betty, the merchant ship that was associated with the HMS Loo? At this point, we have not found the Belander Betty. There are a number of shipwrecks on Looe Key Reef there, and we're continuing to do research. It is going to be a bit of a challenge to locate that ship, but hopefully we'll be able to make an association, because it would be really very interesting to have both of the vessels documented. Yes.
What was the draft of the Loo, and what was the depth of the reef? That it went from 300 to crashing.
Yeah.
So the question is, what is the draft of the HMS Loo, and what is the depth of the reef at Looe Key? So the draft was probably somewhere around 15 feet or so. It's relatively shallow draft, 15, 20 feet. I don't actually have that information I don't think that's recorded anywhere. It basically kind of where it ended up when they stuck all of the stuff in it. But there are places where Looe Key Reef is within, 4 feet of the surface in the area where they wrecked. And so there was pretty much no way that if vessel sails into that, it's not going to completely rip its bottom out and then have all of the material fall into the sand channel. So it's a very bad situation to find themselves in, the sailors. Yes.
You had an image of the blueprint of where did you get that? I mean, is that a recreation, or was that, did you
So
find that in the archives? Or-
yes. So the question is, where did the plan drawing of the HMS Loo come from? And that's actually available on the Royal Museums at Greenwich website. The Greenwich Maritime Museum there has digitized a huge amount of their collections. And if you enter in the right search information, you can find all sorts of these ship plans. So it was pretty amazing that plan so easily available and not requiring that I go to London, as much as I'd love to do that. And that's the story of that, is really that maritime and archaeological research has been so greatly helped by all of the efforts of these research institutions to digitize their collection. So it is so much easier now to access this information as compared to what it was 20 years ago. So there are digital digital newspapers that you can search. You find these great collections. And one of the interesting things, as a comparison, Mendel Peterson, when he was writing up his report on the Loo, actually got a lot of the history wrong, because he did not have easy access to all of the resources that we have now. And that kind of information is just so much more accessible. And it's great to be able to do this research from my desk here in Key Largo.
You mentioned the HMS Bowie. Is that up by what we now call Fowey Light off of Key Biscayne? Is that the same?
Is the
Bowie, Fowey, are they the same? And is that where the wreck is located?
The question was, is the HMS Bowie located near Bowie or Fowey Light in Biscayne National Park? Yes, it is up in that general area. I believe that reef area where the lighthouse is might have been where the vessel struck, but I don't believe that's actually where the shipwreck lies currently. So that's there is a protection zone established by the National Park Service up in that area to protect the remains of the boat. I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce it. I say Bowie, might be Fowey, who knows? Yes, sir.
Yes, out of curiosity, do they have the nautical charts from that period of time? The 1700s to 1750s? And did they update them as they kept ones in shape?
So the question is, are there nautical charts from that time period that we can look at? And can we tell whether they were updating that information as a result of the shipwrecks that were occurring? Yes, there are nautical charts that we can look at from that time. They're not tremendously accurate. And more the problem is that the vessels oftentimes didn't really know where they were, not having our wonderful GPS receivers and things that we have, where they're basically sailing on a dead reckoning situation where they really can't account for what the currents are doing. They can say, hey, we've been heading in this direction of the compass for a certain number of hours, but by no means are they going straight. The currents and other things are. So really what's happening is the charts are being updated with the names of these ships that are wrecking there. So we have Careysport Reef, named after HMS Careysport that grounded there in the 1770s. We have Looe Key. So there is an update happening, but is it really preventing more shipwrecks? Not really. Yes, sir.
I understood you to say Looe Key, the present day Looe Key had been named that for 100+ years, but the Looe Key wreck was not identified until the mid-50s. What was the look on that researcher's face when he saw Loo and he said, well, I've been staying on Looe Key. There had to be an oh gosh moment.
So the question was, if the wreck at Looe Key was not identified in the 1950s, but the name had been around for centuries longer. Imagine what it was like for the researcher to basically have that moment when he connects the two. And I'm sure it was an amazing moment, reinforcing all of the research that he had been doing. And sometimes, those oral history things don't get passed down, and people living in the Florida Keys were probably not terribly concerned as to why Looe Key was named. There are all sorts of place names here in the Florida Keys that have been changed over the years that go from Spanish to English. And there's all sorts of really interesting melding of cultures that results in the place names that we have now today. And so I think he just said, okay, thank God I got this right. It all makes sense. And it's always great to have those sort of epiphany moments when it all comes together. Yes.
Does the video that you were suggesting we watch, does that discuss any of like the collaborative work that's been going on in order to identify some of these wrecks? Like David Gibbons wrote a history of the world in 12 shipwrecks, and this is like pre darky almost, but did that delve into that?
So the question is, does the video that I referenced relating to the cannons at Fort William Henry connect all of these parts and pieces and delve into the full story of the Loo? It does some of it. That video was, I think, produced in 2016, so it doesn't include any of our more recent research or anything like that. But yes, it absolutely makes the connections that, what basically asks the question, so how did these get here? And the investigator recognizes that, well, it just so happens that Art McKee was up in the area giving a presentation, and he just happened to meet up with the right person, and the fort was looking for cannons. And I think they were pulling cannons from all over the place because, where do you get a 18th century cannon when you're building a replica fort? And so I think it was just a aha moment. I've got some cannons, you guys have got some need. I think Art McKee was pretty good at putting those sort of deals together. So yes, please check it out. I think you'd really enjoy it. Yeah. Julia?
Hi, I have a couple of questions from Zoom. John Hazelbaker, he's got two. Number one is, were all the cannons, anchors, and other heavy iron equipment from the Loo recovered? Or are there still some down there?
So do I have to repeat that question, or did everyone?
They can hear me.
Okay. So the question is, are there any of the heavy iron artifacts still down there at the HMS Loo site, such as the cannons and anchors? Our investigation did not find any of the cannons. As we mentioned, those had been likely salvaged. We were not able to locate the one anchor that they referenced seeing in 1950, which is basically the reef is basically has concreted the entire anchor into its substance. And so there's only the ring sticking out of it. We were not able to locate that. It could be that is now buried under sand. But really the iron remains that are down there are the iron ingot ballast pieces.
Okay. Another person asks, what is the year of the video you showed? I believe you said it was 1951, but they commented it looks quite advanced for the 50s.
So the question was, again, what is the year that the video I showed from the trials, what year was that dated to? And my understanding is that was all filmed in 1950 when they first visited the HMS Loo site. So yeah, I think that's pretty amazing footage. I'm not sure, but I imagine it was probably like 8mm film to be able to fit in a small little camera housing. I'm not much of a film buff to know how that works, but the fact that they were able to keep that thing dry within like the rubber balloon sort of thing with a a clip on it, pretty amazing. So when I look at my camera nowadays and I can seal it with a vacuum pump, I'm like, man, that's fantastic. I don't know, how would I have survived back in that day? I think it's just a kind of, you just hope that it doesn't. Yes, sir.
I was diving on the Tres Puentes, and we found a piece of iron about 2 feet by say 6 inches and 6 inches, and it was all we could do to get it in the boat. And so I said, there's one way to find out if it's silver or what it is, put a magnet on it and stuff. Why did they have this iron on that ship?
So the question is, this gentleman was diving on one of the Spanish 1733 shipwrecks, the Tres Puentes, and found a bar of metal. And the question was, so what is this bar of metal made out of? And so I think you're asking, why did they have these iron ingot on these ships? That Spanish vessel, that's a good question. I'm not sure why that would have been on that particular vessel. But the Loo, for example, has, instead of stone ballast down in the bottom of the ship, keeping it upright when the wind is blowing against the sails, it had iron ingot ballast, which was much, much heavier per volume than stone.
It's expensive.
It's expensive, so you have to be sort of a military organization to afford that. And so that's why they had it. And this is a relatively early time period when they start doing this kind of ballasting with iron ingots. You know, the 1733 shipwrecks are almost entirely ballasted with stone. So if you visit one of the other Spanish shipwrecks here in the Florida Keys from 1733, just, you know, basically a little bit of a decade or more earlier, it is ballasted entirely with stone. Even the vessels which were essentially the Spanish warships, the Capitana and the Almirante, those were still ballasted with stone. So there's really this development, and the Royal Navy is pushing the cutting edge in a lot of the development of its Navy during this time period. Yes.
It has a sophisticated magnetometer been developed that could show you pictures of anchors and things that are under the sand?
So the question is there a sophisticated tool like a magnetometer that could be used to show what might be buried under the sand? In general, a magnetometer is going to be so overwhelmed by all of the iron on that site that it's going to be very, very difficult to pinpoint that. There's a tool called a gradiometer, which has essentially two magnetometer sensors put next to each other that you could, if you were really crazy, grid the entire wreck site out and move this foot by foot along these grid lines to get the magnetic reading in very specific things. And you could develop a heat map that shows where the highest concentrations of iron is. So that's, unfortunately, you're not going to get a photographic image to reveal that.
So no one's done anything like that with the Loo on a Loo.
Not with a Loo, and in general, I don't know that the technology can do exactly what you're suggesting. That's fine.
So if under the current sanctuary rules and modern marine archaeology, suppose you did that and you found that there was something underneath there, what would you do?
So the question was, if we had advanced technology and we found that you could image below the sand, the question is, what would we do at that point? And so the question would be really, what information are we trying to get about the site? And if we can do that remotely with, say, this tool, it's far better than actually going in there and digging up the shipwreck. So our preference in general would be to leave it in where it is until we really have that find need that requires excavation. So we would want to use those remote tools if we could, or look to other ways to answer those questions that we're interested in. You know, to know that there's, say, an anchor right there doesn't necessarily tell us all that much about what we're really trying to get to is the lives of the people who sailed on this ship. And that's really what we want to know. What was it like to be on board the HMS Loo, sailing the seas, or crashing into the reef? And so that's the connection that we want to make. We want to tell the stories about.
I have one more question from Zoom, and you might have answered this already, but what island did the HMS Loo crew make it to? Did it have a name?
So the question is, what island did the crew from the HMS Loo make it to, and did it have a name? It did not have a name at that time. It was just a very low sand hump out there, just behind the reef there at Looe Key. And as a result of the wreck of that vessel, it became known as Looe Key. And there was a sandbank there for a certain number of years, but today there's nothing.
And is there, sorry, last question. The L-O-O-L-O-O-E, what's the difference?
So the question is the spelling of the HMS Loo's name. And this is something a little bit up for debate, exactly. Some of the primary sources use L-O-O. Other ones use L-O-O-E. The town in, I believe, southwest England that it's named after is called L-O-O-E. I just don't know how I've been going with LOOE just to kind of make the connection. I might be wrong. We'll just have to dig more into that. It seems likely that earlier versions of these vessels, there were previous Loos before this HMS Loo. Those might have been named LOO, and maybe by the time this one rolled around, it was the LOO. So more to discover.
More to discover.
Is that
I
like
did see,
British harbor?
It could be.
I did see some early Smithsonian reports that was HMS LOO. But yeah,
So the other point was that some of the early Smithsonian reports spell it HMS LOO. I think, unfortunately, that might have been Mr. Peterson not getting the history exactly right, because his reports say that this ship was built around, I think, like 1714 or something like that. And we know that's not the case. That was an earlier rendition of the Loo. So, everyone makes mistakes.
all right. Our last question, and Matthew will be around for those of you that are on site and have some more questions. And again, if you do something in Zoom or watching this later, we'll monitor the questions and get back to Lou and then fill that in. But
So what if I'm a modern day treasure hunter and I want to go find stuff and it's in the National Marine Sanctuary? What rules are there?
So we have an archaeological research permitting program. If you want to conduct archaeological research in the sanctuary that answers specific research questions that can help inform us about the history of the sanctuary, you can get a permit to do so. To go out there and collect artifacts like the cryos we're doing, that is not something that is compatible with the National Marine Sanctuaries Act.
Well
So we do not, these are everyone's resources, and myself as an archaeologist believe strongly that we are holding these in trust for the American people, and that having someone take it home and put it on their mantelpiece where 10 years down the line, it falls to pieces, or their wife gets upset because it's making a mess and throws it in the garbage is not the best use for our archaeological resources.
I have a couple more from Zoom. This question I actually did think was pretty interesting. So when you find a wreck, what happens next in terms of governments, different countries getting involved?
So the question is, when I find a shipwreck here in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, what are some of the next steps? Do other organizations or governments get involved? And the answer is, it all depends on what particular vessel is. In the case of just basic research, I want to document the site to my best I can through a non-intrusive process generally, so that I can understand what's going on there. I want to make sure that when future activities happen in that area, that they're not impacting that archaeological site. In the case of a British warship like the HMS Loo, if we wanted to do something that actually was going to be disturbing the shipwreck site, we would consult with the British government, and through the Sunken Military Craft Act, which is a US law that protects warships and sovereign vessels of all nations. And the United States Navy then expects these other nations to respect US Navy warships wherever they lie. So if we wanted to do some disturbance on the HMS Loo site, we'd want to work closely with British colleagues, make sure that that fit within what they believe is the best way to manage their sunken military craft.
all right.
I got one more question.
Okay, good. This is it.
Okay, this last question. Do you ever use any subsea drones for archaeological mapping of these sites?
So the question is, do I ever use subsea drones for the archaeological mapping of these sites? And absolutely, a autonomous underwater vehicle is a tremendous tool, very much like, the drones that we think of flying through the air. This one, you just program it in and it runs underwater. It looks a lot like a torpedo generally, runs transects back and forth, gathering data with a sonar or a magnetometer. We then recover that data and are able to download it. Those tools work really well in deep water where it's hard to access because you need a really large ship and a really long cable, for example. But we have used underwater drones here in the Florida Key Sanctuary to do that same sort of mapping. And it's really fantastic because that means I can sit back on the boat and let the technologist put that equipment in the water and just get the data when it comes back. So it's a great tool, still a little pricey to use though.
All right, thank you. And again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for those of you that are participating online. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and you'll get all kind of fun videos. So thank you. Thank you also Noah and the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary for letting us borrow you tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.